Hello again, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist David Percy. Up first, a hazardous weather graphic. There's a coastal flood warning out through tonight. Coastal flood warning remains out for St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait coast, as well as the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue Sound area and the northwest coast. And the Arctic coast there, the western Arctic coast from Wainwright down to Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, or to Cape Lisburne. And that's out until midday Monday for continued possible coastal flooding as that low lingers and slowly weakens there just west of Cape Lisburne. Otherwise, a flood watch is out for the Copper River Basin now, and that's out from late Monday night until late Wednesday night for additional rainfall that could result in some flooding conditions, if it's enough, across the Copper River Basin. That includes Valdez and Cordova there along the eastern North Gulf Coast. And lastly, there's a wind advisory out for the eastern Alaska Range for Monday night, actually tomorrow, Monday and Monday night through Monday night until about 6 a.m. Tuesday. And that's for south winds expected to increase late tonight and tomorrow to 30 miles an hour sustained with possible gusts of 55 miles an hour through the passes of the eastern Alaska Range, mostly west of the Toe Cutoff. And from there, going to satellite imagery, you can see that low moving northward there. Now it looks to be west-northwest of Cape Lisburne, roughly, give or take, slowly weakening and also really slowing down. It's going to kind of remain nearly stationary up there, kind of wobble around in the Chukchi Sea there and just dissipate over the next couple of days. So I'll keep the southwest winds going. Still currently 30 to 40 mile an hour wind gusts being reported from south coast of the Seward Peninsula on up into Kotzebue and then North Kivalina and to Cape Lisburne, seeing again down to 30 to 40 miles per hour from the southwest. So that keeping the surf up there. And about all I've heard that was new was possible flooding in Kivalina overnight last night. And that's all I've heard for anything additional. So conditions really improved from what they were yesterday. Winds have gone light down along the southwest coast there into the Pribilofs and Alaska Peninsula. Kind of a break in between that system and the moisture sliding northeastward there, as you can see, coming across Bristol Bay. Had some sunshine over Cook Inlet early today, but now a lot of high clouds spreading in over south central Alaska into the Copper River Basin, western Copper River Basin, Prince William Sound area, as well as Kodiak Island, with some breaks down there, allowing temperatures in the lower to mid-60s this afternoon. But any precipitation now appears to be over toward the Aleutian Range or south of the Alaska Peninsula, but there's a system there be developing, moving northward, spreading rain up across south central Alaska this evening and continuing tonight through tomorrow. Otherwise, some scattered showers earlier over the panhandle there. That resulted in about 3/100ths of an inch at Sitka, 4/100ths at Juneau today, so pretty light there, and that'll be tapering off. Now's about it as far as any precipitation goes for the panhandle. Dry over the southern interior. Rain starting to slide up across Bristol Bay up into Iliamna Lake. And then that weakening low there just west-northwest of Cape Lisburne, give or take. About 988 millibars, continuing to slowly weaken. And winds still pretty gusty there. But even the winds will continue to come down as well. The trough extending west-southwestward there and toward the western Aleutians. Next low, roughly in the Bristol Bay area, quite weak, and we'll see tonight that moves up to Togiak Bay or so with warm front rain spreading into the southern Kenai Peninsula. Actually, rain spreads up into the Anchorage area. It looks like sometime early this evening with showers developing over the Susitna Valley up in toward the Alaska Range. Should stay dry over much of the Copper River Basin. Rainfall chances increase over the Prince William Sound area to about Cordova or so. Will stay dry from Yakutat and variably cloudy over the Panhandle, basically under the influence of high pressure there over the Yukon, and then the one down to the southwest. Interior, dry conditions, maybe some clearing, especially along the Yukon River Valley area up into the flats, and also some clearings showing up along the eastern Arctic coast, North Slope, with that general offshore flow condition. Chance of light rain over the western Arctic coast. Rainfall amounts heaviest today was at Indian Mountain. They picked up 3/4 of an inch. That's kind of the exception. Other areas are quite light. Koyuk had 1/3 of an inch there in Norton Bay. And so really not much of a rain producer at all. It was really still more of a wind producer, but everything diminishing there. Showers over the Bering Sea, high pressure developing out there over the western Bering ahead of the next system pushing in toward Kamchatka Peninsula. And for tomorrow, that low moves into the Kuskokwim Valley area. Periods of rain across all of southern Alaska, spreading eastward to Yakutat, but not quite making it past Dry Bay or so. Increasing clouds over the northern Panhandle areas. And for the North Slope and Arctic coast, not too bad, especially on the east side there. Chance of rain, that low lingers. And winds will continue to come down there. Still a little breezy there from Kivalina up to Cape Lisburne, but light across much of the Arctic coast up there. And a trough keeping it showery along the southwest coast into the Bering Sea. Not too bad there, actually, for the Alaska Peninsula. And then we'll see on Tuesday, that next storm pushes in eastward there, and that pushes a ridge of high pressure right over the eastern Bering Sea and along the west coast for light winds and just some isolated shower activity now. Should be dry for the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians to about Amchitka. Gale force winds, though, come into the western Aleutians during the afternoon and into the western Bering Sea, and then that system will push eastward and slowly weaken as it does. And the next system there in the Gulf of Alaska kind of coming northward there with the warm front. Rain becoming moderate to possibly heavy at times along the North Gulf Coast and into the Copper River Basin. That's responsible for the flood watch in those areas. And it looks like a little bit of rain will slip down to the north coast of the Panhandle with increasing clouds elsewhere, but still maybe some sun breaks down around Prince of Wales Island, Ketchikan, Annette, over toward Misty Fjords in those areas. With mostly cloudy with a scattered shower condition over the areas, Kuskokwim Valley, up along the Alaska, up along the upper Yukon Valley areas, and a chance of rain, fog, and drizzle for the eastern Arctic coast with that low there over Mackenzie Bay. Moving on to lows tonight, 40s for the Panhandle, lower 40s for the North Gulf Coast, upper 30s in the Copper River Basin, lower 50s around Kodiak Island. Highs for tomorrow, 50s, lower to mid-50s most areas, except Homer up to 58, Kodiak back to near 60, lower 60s southern Panhandle, upper 50s to the north. Lows on Tuesday morning, upper 30s in the Kuskokwim Valley, mid-40s for the Copper River Basin, warmer with the moisture and southerly flow coming in. About the same for south central Alaska, Kodiak Island, lower 40s Bristol Bay, and in the 40s to lower 50s for the Panhandle and North Gulf Coast. Highs on Tuesday, 50s, most areas, even upper 50s Kodiak Island, but still warmest conditions, southern Panhandle, mid-60s there, upper 50s central and northern areas to about Yakutat. Up to the north, lows in the upper 30s for the Arctic coast, lower 30s in the Brooks Range, and in the 30s down into the Tanana Valley to the Alaska Range, but dropping down to 29 at Eagle, otherwise near 40 out toward the Bering Strait. Highs tomorrow, mid to upper 50s eastern interior, in the 40s out to the west and to the north to the Arctic coast. Looks like some areas of the North Slope could push into the lower 50s. Lows the following morning, mostly in the 30s, most areas, except some lower 40s still showing up around Fairbanks to North Pole. And the highs the following day, a little cooler, but 40s along the Arctic coast and 50s in the eastern interior, mid to upper 40s out toward the west. And for the southwest coast, lower to mid 40s for that area, in the 40s for the Aleutians, highs in the 50s. They'll be followed by lows Tuesday morning, back into the lower to mid 40s, upper 30s for St. Lawrence Island, followed by highs near 50 for the Pribilofs, mid 50s in the central Aleutians, lower 40s St. Lawrence Island.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And moving on to flying weather, got a little too fast there. Monday morning, some IFR along the southern slopes of the Brooks Range. Pretty good conditions north of the mountains there, out to the Arctic coast. And actually IFR extending out to about Kivalina northward to Cape Lisburne. And marginal VFR across the Seward Peninsula, Bering Strait. And then a little bit more widespread IFR from Nunivak Island to the Pribilofs. And even more widespread there from western Cook Inlet and the southern Kuskokwim Valley into Togiak, Bristol Bay, Aleutian Range, and a portion of the Alaska Peninsula. Then scattered areas of IFR westward to Atka Island. IFR for the North Gulf Coast, southern coast of the Seward Peninsula, and eastward to just west of Cape St. Elias. VFR, though, from Yakutat down the Panhandle and areas of the eastern interior north of the Alaska Range. And then for the afternoon, main IFR area in the Gulf of Alaska, up across Resurrection Bay into possibly Portage, and more likely Whittier, Passage Canal area, Prince William Sound, and up to the Coast Range. Marginal VFR spreading into Yakutat and increasing along the extreme north coast of the Panhandle, but staying VFR over the southeast coast. VFR, mid and upper Tanana Valley, northward to the Yukon Flats, North Slope and Arctic coast. Marginal VFR, much of the western interior, down across much of the Bering Sea as well. And then for Tuesday morning, IFR still along and south of the Brooks Range, probably into the northern Koyukuk Valley and a portion of the Kobuk Valley, but IFR for the Selawik, Noatak Valley areas, Kotzebue and Buckland, maybe Shishmaref, but looks like that IFR goes down to almost into Norton Bay. And then some isolated IFR over the southwest interior, western Alaska Range, with pretty much marginal VFR in the interior, but Cook Inlet, VFR down to Kodiak Island, IFR eastern North Gulf Coast, now slipping into the northern Panhandle, and marginal VFR over the Bering Sea, but improving as you head west. And then for the afternoon, that changes. This next system pushes IFR into the western Aleutian, southwest Bering Sea area. And marginal VFR over the western interior from the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, down to Togiak Bay. VFR, though, Bristol Bay into Kodiak Island, south central Alaska VFR, Prince William Sound, right on up in across the eastern interior. North Slope Arctic Coast, VFR. IFR now over the Yakutat area into the northern Panhandle. And Fort Passes, Anatuvik, IFR trending toward marginal VFR in the afternoon, improving trend for Adigan with the lowest conditions early on Monday. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, same pattern, IFR in the morning, a little bit better in the afternoon, and improving throughout the day for Rainy as well, but probably staying marginal VFR. And windy, marginal VFR with better conditions to the north, lower conditions south side. That same pattern also for Isabel. Better conditions on the north entrance, probably VFR, and then south entrance marginal. Mintasta, same pattern, south entrance marginal, north side VFR. And for Tanita, kind of a marginal VFR day for Monday coming up. And Portage, IFR, lowest conditions eastern entrance. And Chilkoot and White, another VFR day for Monday. And then the freezing levels, 2,000 feet over the northern part of the state, northwest part of the state, as well as much of the Bering Sea, 4,000 feet just south of the Aleutians, 6,000 to 10,000 feet along the Gulf of Alaska into the Panhandle. And icing, considerable moderate sliding northward with that moisture band into the North Gulf Coast above about 7,000 feet. And then isolated moderate with the remains of that storm there over the Chukchi Sea. And looking at the jet stream, sharp trough along the west coast and eastern Bering there. And west of that trough, we've got southwest winds 120 knots into the west central interior areas. And 9,000 feet, 50 knot southwesterlies over the Copper River Basin and up along the Alaska Range. And then lighter winds out over the Bering Sea, 3,000-foot winds, showing a low inland there over the Kuskokwim Valley, another one, the old one there over the Chukchi Sea. Lighter winds with that one as it continues to weaken, south 40 knots right into the North Gulf Coast, and also for turbulence, surface 6,000 feet, considerable moderate there for the eastern North Gulf Coast, light to isolated moderate up over the western Arctic coast.
So that Galena flood back in 2013 was at the intersection of weather and climate. Rick, I often get questions about the difference between weather and climate. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, John. One of the analogies that I like to use, the wardrobe analogy. So in my closet, in my dresser, I've got clothes appropriate for 90-degree weather and 50 below weather. That's the climate part of my wardrobe. Well, what I'm going to put on today, am I going to wear my Hawaiian shirt because it's going to be a hot July day, or am I going to wear my bunny boots because it's going to be 50 below? That's the weather part of my wardrobe.
You know, there's another interesting analogy. I've heard it said that climate is like your personality, whereas weather is like the mood you're in today. It's like that old John Denver song. Some days are diamonds and some days are stones. That's how weather works.
Of course, it's really a continuous range. Just as the Galena ice jam flooding was the result of a weather event, that ice jam, up against that cold spring, a climate event. So too with less impactful events. For instance, a daily record high temperature is a weather event, one day's high. But we put that in a climate context, say comparing to a century or more of individual temperatures on a given date.
So these extreme events like record high temperatures also happen on the seasonal time scale. Just in the last few years, we've had what was called a marine heat wave in the waters south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. But the water temperatures in that area set new records in 2015 and 2016.
And most Alaskans are acutely aware that big wildfire seasons are becoming more and more common, most recently in 2015. And the frequency of million-acre seasons has doubled since the early 1990s.
Just this past winter, we had another event in the Bering Sea. The ice extent in the Bering was lower than it had ever been in the last 150 years. That's about as far back as the good records go. There'd never been another year like this one in the Bering with so little sea ice. That had major impacts on the communities along the west coast and the northwest coast.
So, John, what have you been hearing from folks around town about these kind of climate extremes?
I've heard from a number of people who've been here a long time that winters just aren't what they used to be. The average temperatures are higher than they were back in the 1960s and 1970s, and we just don't get the extreme cold days, the days down in the minus 50s or even the minus 60s that we used to experience in Fairbanks back in the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s.
Well, and it's not just winter either. 2016 and 2017, the summers brought unusually muggy, humid weather to Fairbanks. We're not used to thinking of that in interior Alaska, but record high humidities during the summer months. As in the winter, we've had a significant increase in freezing rain events, since about 2000. So much so that DOT has changed their road treatment strategy, and now we have the school district building in winter rain days into the calendar. And of course, we all need good weather forecasts for these high impact weather events.
We know, though, that weather forecasts are sometimes wrong just 3 or 4 days in advance. So if these weather forecasts and the models they're based on can't pick up events like freezing rain 3 or 4 days ahead, how can we believe what they say about climate for the future?
Well, that's a really good question, John. And I think the important thing to remember is that parts of the system are predictable.
So climate models can't give you weather for particular days or even for particular months or years. They actually predict averages. These are averages over periods of a decade or two, or even averages over periods of several years. So they don't give us the month-to-month information that we might want. What are they telling us about the future, though?
Well, these climate models are telling us on the decades-long time frames that warmer winters are going to become more common. We're going to have more frequent, very low sea ice years with late freeze up and early meltout. And the same will be true on Alaskan rivers. We'll have more frequent seasons when freeze up is late and break up is early.
One of the other common threads in these climate model predictions is that heavy rain events and heavy snow events will become more common in the future. That's actually a prediction that the models make for mid-latitudes as well as for high latitudes in areas like Alaska. So we can expect the heavy downpours to become heavier and the heavy winter snows to become heavier than we've been used to. They're also predicting more frequent freezing rain events, getting back to what you talked about earlier. These events that might have happened just once every year or two in the past could actually end up happening several times in a winter in the future, according to the climate models.
And it is important to remember that even in a warming world, there are still going to be seasons and years that are colder than the average, but these cold seasons will become less and less common. So, John, maybe I don't need to have those bunny boots in my closet anymore?
Well, at least you won't need to wear them as often as you did in the past.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Marine forecast for the south coast on Monday. Northwest winds 15 to 20 knots, seas around 10 feet. North coast, west winds at 10 knots. Central northern inside waters, light variable winds with slight seas for Monday. Clarence Strait, winds will be out of the northwest at 15 knots. And then for the day on Tuesday, south coast along Prince of Wales Island, northwest winds 15 knots. Central coast south at 15 knots. And then the north coast, small craft advisories. South winds 25 to 30 knots with seas up to around 10 feet. Lincoln Isle Glacier Bay, northern inner channel, south winds 20 knots. Stevens Passage, south at 15. And light northwest breeze for Clarence Strait. And for Prince William Sound, Monday, small craft advisories. Southeast winds 30 knots, seas 6 feet. Small craft advisories for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Southeast winds 25 knots with 7-foot seas. And for the Barren Islands, small craft advisories. South winds 25 knots. Small craft advisories Kamishak Bay. Southeast winds 25 knots. And small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet for south winds at 25 knots. North of the Forelands, winds will be southeast at 20. And for Tuesday, Cook Inlet, northwest winds 10 to 20 knots, strongest south of the Forelands. And for the Kamishak Bay and Barren Island areas, small craft advisories, west winds 30 knots, 8-foot seas. Small craft advisories, western North Gulf Coast, west winds 25 knots, 7-foot seas. Become southwest at 20 for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, east winds at 10 knots. Kodiak Island for Monday, south winds 20 knots, seas 8 feet. Alaska Peninsula, west winds 15 knots, seas 5 to 6 feet. And Bristol Bay, west winds at 20 knots with 5-foot seas. For Tuesday, Bristol Bay, west winds 15 knots. Alaska Peninsula, west to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, seas around 4 feet. Kodiak Island, west winds 20 to 25 knots. Eastern Aleutians, eastern and central Aleutians, west winds tomorrow 15 knots, seas 5 to 6 feet. Amchitka Island, west at 20. And from Kiska to Shimia, northwest winds 15 knots with 6-foot seas. Then gales come into the picture on Tuesday, actually Monday night, and then spread eastward during the day Tuesday. For the western Aleutians, gale warning southwest 40 knots. And also for the Adak-Atka area, southwest winds 40 knots, seas either side of 10 feet. And for Unmak Island, west-southwest winds 35 knots. Small craft advisories for Unalaska Island, west winds 25 to 30 knots. For Monday, for the Yukon Delta coast, light variable winds at 10 knots for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, west-southwest, 15 knots. And south of Nunivak Island, Kuskokwim Delta coast, west at 20. St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, winds will be southwest at 15 knots. And for Monday, St. Lawrence Island, northwest winds 15 knots. Otherwise, gale warnings coming into St. Matthew Island, south winds increasing to 35 knots with seas building to 12 feet. Southwest winds increasing to 30 knots for the Pribilofs. And for the southwest coast, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And up on the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, for Monday, we're looking at south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the central coast, south at about 15 knots, seas running about 3 to 4 feet. Higher seas and winds there on the west side, but small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast, south winds 25 knots. All the way down to Cape Thompson to Wales, southwest winds at 20 knots, seas at 6 feet. And for Tuesday, small craft advisories, Wales to Cape Thompson, northwest winds 25 knots, and northeast winds 20 knots from Cape Thompson to Cape Beaufort, western Arctic coast northeast at 15, central coast northeast at 10, and east-northeast winds at 15 knots for the eastern Arctic coast, seas running 3 to 5 feet for the central and east side, and as high as 10 feet there around those western capes. And for tonight, that low kind of becomes nearly stationary there, just drifting slowly northward, and then sort of stops and slowly weakens. So winds, rain coming down, seas coming down, and light winds expand northward across the Seward Peninsula and are light all the way down into Bristol Bay and really much of the Aleutians and Bering Sea. And rain spreading northward tonight into southern Alaska, expands to the North Gulf Coast tomorrow, and low pressure lingers off the western Arctic coast, continues to weaken into a weak trough on Tuesday. Next big storm coming into the western Bering Sea, and then rain, heavy at times, a flood watch out for the Copper River Basin, Cordova, and Valdez for additional rain that could possibly cause.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.